So today we're going to talk about the principle of proportion. Proportion is one of the principles of design. It's how an artist puts things together. So if you take a look at the first picture and draw on your background knowledge, what does proportion mean to you? So proportion in art is how one piece or element relates to other pieces or elements or to the whole. So how one piece relates to other pieces or how one piece relates to the whole. As in this photograph, how does the wrinkle texture relate to other textures? The wrinkle texture takes over. There's a lot more of that wrinkle texture than anything else, like the smooth, shiny metal or the soft hair. So that's how it relates to the other textures. How does the black and white part relate to the colored part? There's much more black and white. The color is relatively small compared to the black and white part, but the color really captures your eye. How does the size of one figure relate to the size of the other? Well, it relates in such a way that it couldn't possibly be real. One figure is way bigger than the other, so this doesn't represent real life. So this is where we pause and we watch this YouTube video on proportion. Now, while proportion can describe a variety of relationships of art elements, most people tend to concentrate on size. So yes, proportion can be about texture, it can be about color, it can be about all those other elements, but most people tend to think about size. There are two types of size proportion categories: standard versus non-standard. So standard proportion is what is expected. We might call it normal. So this example here in this painting, there is a normal relationship between the figures and the buildings in the distance. While the figures are much bigger, we understand that that's because they're closer and the buildings are further away. But this is a normal relationship. This is standard proportion. Where non-standard is not expected, or what we might call abnormal. You might also hear non-standard proportion called distortion. And here in this example, it may be hard to see, but it is a photo with some sort of sculpture. It almost kind of looks like a mylar balloon of maybe a dancer, a seated dancer, and she is much, much bigger than we would expect a figure to be in relationship to the buildings around her and in relationship to the actual humans around her. So this is non-standard proportion, or what we might call distortion. So what would a portrait look like that used non-standard proportions? Think about that, a portrait of a person's face that is not using expected proportions. It might be a caricature. Now maybe you've been to a theme park or you've been to some sort of festival where an artist was drawing caricatures. And this is because it doesn't look normal. It's supposed to be funny. If you see here, here's the man that it's based off of. So it kind of looks like him, but not exactly, right? They've made his nose way bigger. They've made his eyes really small and close together. Now, artists spend a lot of time learning standard proportions. There is a science and a math to how the typical person's eyes relate to their head, or how their nose relates to their mouth. There are typical proportions, and artists spend a lot of time studying this. Same thing with the human figure, right? There's a particular place where most people's arms hit on their legs, right? Unless there's some sort of syndrome or something has happened, these things normally happen. So artists can either choose standard or non-standard. And here, think about this by Jacob Lawrence. This piece of work, is this standard or non-standard? This is definitely non-standard, and the parts that really stick out to me are the figure's arms and hands. They're much bigger. They're even a little bit bigger maybe than her head. But if we look at Harriet Tubman, we see the title, we know that she was a strong person, so I believe this distortion or this non-standard proportion is meant to show her strength and her power. Whether an artist chooses standard or non-standard size proportions in their artwork, there is a reason. Very often that reason is to send a certain message or create a particular mood. So let's take a closer look at an artist who used non-standard proportion in his portrait work. He is Amedeo Modigliani. And you need to pause here and go watch the video. So this is what I want us to take some notes on. I want you to write in your sketchbook this right here. His subjects' faces are blank-like with blank necks, blank noses, sharp blank, blank-shaped eyes, and button-shaped blank. So if we study some of his work, maybe we can start to fill in some of those words. What kinds of eyes? What kinds of noses? What kinds of necks? What would you say about his work? So the words I'm looking for is that his faces are mask-like. Remember, he had that influence from African masks with elongated necks, just a fancy word for long, angular noses, sharp chins, almond-shaped eyes, and button-shaped mouths. So what would you say about the color in these works? Look at the color and what would you say? I definitely wouldn't say they're bright and fluorescent, right? They're probably dull in some areas, mixed in with a lot of gray, it looks like. The reds aren't particularly bright, so you might need to think about that when we choose to do our Modigliani-inspired portrait. The backgrounds are fairly simple. There's lots of colors that are mixed in, so it's not just large areas of the same color, they're mixed in with other colors. So we're going to do a Modigliani-inspired portrait, and it must fill the page. It must have features like Modigliani's portraits, and it must have color throughout and color mixing. So we're going to do this in 2 steps. 1, we sketch in pencil either a male or female portrait with his features. We should know what those features are. And then step 2, we are going to either use crayon or colored pencil to fill in all the space. Be sure to mix colors. So if you see in my example, the red isn't the red right out of the crayon box. It's red mixed with brown to sort of dull and darken the red. Her skin tone is a bunch of orange and red and yellow mixed together. I have used colored pencils in places to make it sharper where the crayon was too thick to get into small corners. I used colored pencils. So this is what I want you to do. And I'll leave you here. This is some of the work you can look at to inspire yourself.